Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Friday, 2026, and it's 5 June, 2026 years after Jesus. We're in the backyard again by the pool, leaving today, but I thought I would get another episode out on the creation of the presidency, 1775 to 1789, by Charles C. Thach, a study in constitutional history. We're discussing the chapter National Executive Power, 1776 to 1787. In the next episode of the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. Happy birthday. And enjoy that waterfall. I don't have a cigar today, just water. I'm still doing some work, so I can't partake when I'm working. I got to do some work after this. But yeah, so let's do noise removal on. And we'd like to thank Liberty Fund Press for making this material available. We'd like to thank Charles C. Thach Jr. for writing it. His dates are 1894 to 1966. We're going to do a fair use of this, make a transformative reading of this book. Go out, get your copy today. Get a physical copy and follow along. We're in Chapter 3, National Executive Power. National Executive Power, 1776 to 1787. This is the background for the creation of the presidency. Thach starts by saying it is manifestly not within the scope of the present study to undertake a complete investigation of the solution given the problem of national executive power prior to 1787. To do so would be to duplicate work that has in large measure been satisfactorily done and would, in any event, transcend the limits of both time and space available for a doctoral dissertation. Now recall, this is his Ph.D. dissertation at Johns Hopkins University, 1922. It was published. Our purpose will be rather, as in the preceding chapter, to go behind the details and search for the tendencies of governmental thought produced by national experience and for the principles of executive organization which this experience seemed to dictate. For the sake of clarity, however, it may be well to restate the problem with which the revolutionists were confronted. The general scope of national power was determined on the one hand by the mere fact of war, on the other by the peculiar domestic situation. Thus, the national governing body was obliged, since it was at war. Remember, that was at war with King George III and Great Britain. Remember, okay? Revolutionary War, we call it. Thus, the national governing body was obliged, since it was at war, to create an army and a navy to recruit them, officer them, arm them, supply them, and determine their use and movements. Page 46 at the top. Let me look at this. Okay, keep going. To do these things, money was necessary, and so a revenue had to be raised and expended, accounts kept, and an audit system created. When independence came to be the aim of the revolutionists, there arose the additional necessity of establishing and maintaining relations with such members of the family of nations as would enter into them. All right. The composition and organization of the national governing body was as plainly determined by the fact that the revolutionary movement involved 13 governmental units lacking any prior formal organic connection, the one with the other. Representatives of these units, coming together in the first instance for purposes of discussion, were forced by the pressure of events to undertake the business of government. But the corporate body did not lose for that reason. its essential character of a council of ambassadors. Now, this is a very important point he's making about national executive power prior to the Constitution, but after I got a helicopter flying over me. Um, After 1776, July 4th, there was no president, remember, there was no king. So who's in charge of the army? Well, it's presumably Congress. Well, how's that work out? It's the states, right? Okay, how's that work out? This is what he's getting into here. Um, Representatives of these units coming together in the first instance for purposes of discussion were forced by the pressure of events to undertake the business of government. But the corporate body did not lose for that reason its essential character of a council of ambassadors. Yeah, that's a big problem. Consequently, votes were taken by states, and after formal ratification of the articles, a high proportion of the affirmative votes was required for any important positive action. Strict limitations on the power of this Congress also resulted from the domestic situation. In fact, Congress was prevented by it from becoming a legislative body at all. Wow. I forgot this part. This is entertaining. Yeah, this is an important thing right here. They were freaked out by executive power and they were freaked out by legislative power. It could work out general policies, but it could not enforce them except over against the officers of its own creation. It was totally without power to lay down general rules of conduct to which all citizens should conform, subject to penalty. Despite its name, the counterpart of Congress in the state organization was the State Council of the Maryland type. Its activities from first to last were necessarily executive in the modern sense of the term, or administrative. The experiment was an extremely interesting one from the governmental point of view. The utter lack of competing governmental organs, the plural character of the executive body. Did you catch that? The plural character of the executive body. See, this is a problem. Its internal organization and the nature of the complexity of its tools alike contribute to to distinguish it from similar experiments. And as was the case with the state constitutions in general, the chief value derived from the observation of the experiment was a negative one, right? There's no governor like the states. The national experience, the national executive power, there is nobody in charge. It's a bunch of randos in a committee. It ain't working out well. It ain't working out. Or a bunch of ambassadors that need to vote on things. Okay. The results obtained were seen to be unsatisfactory. Page 47 at the top. These results were attributed to certain faults of organization. Yeah, hello, as my mentor Michael Ullman would say. It was these faults that the makers of the Constitution desired to remedy. Amen, bro. Congress was, however, not a static body, but a sheer force of necessity. But by sheer force of necessity, there was gradually evolved a method of performing governmental functions quite different from the method adopted at the outset. Okay, so they're learning, right? But it's a painful learning. In the early days of its existence, Congress attempted to pass on everything while acting as a corporate whole. Having reached a decision, it entrusted it entrusted its execution to whatever agency seemed at the moment most convenient. Perhaps a committee of its own membership, perhaps a state council or convention, perhaps individuals without official status. Such agencies, having carried out the order in question, immediately lapsed. There was neither plan nor organization. Congress was primarily itself the executive, the administrator. What could possibly go wrong? Let's take a breather and listen to the waterfall. Happy Friday to you. I mean, this is stressing me out. There's nobody in charge of there's no chief executive. Okay? This is a general lesson that's learned not only in business, nonprofits. You have to have a chief executive. You have to. You got to have somebody in charge. And this is what Donald Trump understands on an intuitive level. When he reads Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it says the president, as the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. Period. He. A president of the United States of America. Period. He. So, now, what could go wrong with Congress as an administrator? Okay, noise removal on. Let's continue. The first step in governmental development was forced by the increasing complexity of business and the physical inability of Congress to do certain things. This step was the partial transformation of the central body from an active administrator to the enactor of administrative laws for subordinate agencies of a permanent character. That is to say, Congress found itself obliged to step up permanent agencies to fix their duties by permanent rules, to provide means for controlling them in their activities, and to determine their relations to the only body possessed of original power, itself. This process was carried out slowly and hesitantly. Page 49 at the bottom. Let me take a look at these footnotes. I'm going to skip the footnotes. So this process was carried out slowly and hesitantly and most inadequately. Page 48 at the top. The creation of the office of the commander-in-chief and the preparation of his instructions is an early example and a typical one. The active duties of the office were left entirely uncertain, as were its relations to the Congress. And, in fact, when the lower offices of the Army were created, especially the commissary generals. Now, remember that one. We're going to come back to the commissary general. Don't forget, commissary general. Okay, Articles of Confederation. Don't forget, page 48 at the top. In fact, when the lower offices of the Army were created, especially the commissary generals and the quartermaster general offices, no attempt was made to describe their duties at all. Okay, these guys are rookies, man. They are rookies, but you know what? We're going through this because you have to understand they didn't just declare independence and you know, great, we're good to go, you know. Let me do that again. They didn't just declare independence and then boom, everything's great. No, there was very difficult learning here on how to do administration, how to actually execute effectively. Very difficult learning. School of hard knocks here. Okay? Now, if this had been indicative of a desire on the part of Congress to rid itself of administrative details and to vest ample powers in the hands of competent administrative or military officers, there would be little complaint or ground for criticism. Such, of course, was not the case. It was incompetency, not liberality, that determined the lack of system. I'm going to read that again. I'm going to read it again. It was incompetency, not liberality, that determined the lack of system. Incompetency. Congress was and remained conspicuously unwilling to divest itself of power. Okay, what could go wrong? You have a legislative body that won't let go of any power, even though there's no executive, and you definitely need a separate executive. You have to, but they won't let go of power. See, this is the background of the Constitution. I got noise removal on so you can hear me better. This is the background of the Constitution, where they're separating. They're like, yeah, we need a separate executive. Now, it is for this reason that the administrative agency, acting under rules set for it by Congress, took the form rather of the committee of Congress rather than that of non-congressional office. Very important thing, very important. Certain of the latter were, in fact, created at an early date, notably the office of treasurer, a purely ministerial position, and that of postmaster general, to which considerable power of appointment and considerable administrative discretion was attached. Remember that concept of administrative discretion. That's going to be very important going forward as you try to understand this material. Remember, administrative discretion, very important. Okay, make a note of it. But the committee was the real seedbed for administrative growth. We have cited an illustration of the committee acting as agent to carry out a single order of Congress. There was another phase of committee activity which deserves notice, that of investigation of and report on either some single matter or a program of work. I'm skipping the footnotes, 48 at the bottom. It was a natural and probably unconscious development to combine these two elements of committee activity to give the same body that reported a measure of task of carrying it out, to assign other business of the same kind to the same group, and to create in that way a permanent body. Page 49 at the top. Was that confusing? I'm going to read it again. It was a natural and probably unconscious development to combine these two elements of committee activity, to give to the same body that reported a measure the task of carrying it out, to assign other business of the same kind to the same group, and to create in that way a permanent body. Gradually, the necessity of at least a degree of systematization was brought home, and the duties of these committees were regulated by permanent ordinances. A striking illustration of this process is the origin of the Naval Committee. On October 5th, what year is this? Come on, Thach. On October 5th, a committee of 3 was appointed to prepare a plan for intercepting 2 vessels which are on their way to Canada laden with arms and power. October 5th, is this 1776? Can you give us a hint here, bub? Well, this is his dissertation exactly as written, so we're getting the frustrating parts as well, but I mean, he must mean 1776, I'm assuming. It's during war, obviously. Okay, so on the 5th and 6th on the 5th and 6th, this committee reported, and on the 13th, it was decided to fit out a swift sailing vessel for a cruise of 3 months. A special committee of 3 being appointed to prepare an estimate of the expense and to contract with proper persons to fit out the vessel, while also reporting their opinion on an additional vessel and an estimate of its cost. On October 30th, the report was received, together with additional recommendations, whereupon 4 members were added to its numbers to carry into execution with all possible execution. That's what it says, as well as the resolutions of Congress passed the 13th instant, as those passed this day for fitting out armed vessels. That's a direct quote. That's why it's so clunky. This committee, so adventitiously created, became the head of the naval establishment. What could go wrong? You got a bunch of people in a committee that are the head of the Navy. You can see the seeds of this. This is going to be a major problem. This is going to be a major problem. In war, in executive functions, you need to have one person in charge who can make decisions, bam, and carry things out. A committee, things get bogged down. There's argument. There's, there's lazy people. They don't do the work. The one guy does all the work, doesn't get any of the credit. The lazy people hide. If there's a mistake, no one takes responsibility for it. It's a disaster. Well, anyway, Thach is getting to that. Okay. Now, in its dual capacity as administrator, it reported measures for congressional consideration, fitted out ships, prepared sailing instructions, functioned, in short, as what in fact it really was, an embryonic Department of Naval Affairs, until supplanted by a similar body, the Marine Committee. Oh man, page 49 at the bottom. This is so good. No formal ordinance was drafted determining the exact competence of these naval committees. The first enactment of the sort being the ordinance of October 28th, 1779. Now we have a date. Well, geez, thank you. So 3 years later, creating the Admiralty Board. See how slowly this is going? Okay, apparently in 1776 you have Navy Marines. Then you don't even have Admiralty Board until 3 years later. Nevertheless, isolated resolutions determined its competence from time to time and taken as a whole form a body of administrative law for separate and subordinate administrative organ for a separate and subordinate administrative organ in a very real sense. For several were general in character and contradistinction to the special orders of in contradistinction to special orders of earlier times. Page 50. There is no need further to follow the details of this interesting development. Suffice it to say that in the same fashion that the Naval Committee came into existence, there sprang up other bodies, such as the Standing Committee of Five for superintending the Treasury. Notice these are all committees with multiple members, which is a legislative thing. It's not an executive thing. The executive, the more they're developing and progressing into understanding the nature of the executive per se, the further they get away from committees. That's the key point. Committees are like legislative, okay? And the executive is more like a single individual. So this is the point. He's showing you the earliest executive departments were actually in the legislative branch, and they had legislative characters, which is why they sucked so bad. And this is the pain that the revolutionaries are finding themselves in, which leads to the Constitution, where you now have a president in charge. The executive power shall be vested in one man, a president of the United States of America. Okay, now this is very important here. Now, there sprang up other bodies such as the Standing Committee of Five for superintending the Treasury, the Board of War and Ordnance, which, despite its title, was only another committee, a medical committee. You notice it's committee, 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 committee. That's because Congress is doing it, and Congress only knows about committees. It's a legislative body, and it thinks it's like everything is you're a surgeon, and everything you cut it with the scalpel, even when it just needs a band-aid or it needs something else. And so that's how legislators think, is everything's got to be committee, committee, committee. And they're going to find out you can't fight war with a committee. You just can't. You're going to screw it up, dude. So this is about learning about executive power per se. And a medical committee, which thought throughout the war exercised an independent power of supervision over the hospital service. The secret committee. Oh man, what a disaster that would be. The secret committee, superseded by the Commerce Committee, which kept in charge the important and probably lucrative business of importation of military supplies, and the very important Committee of Secret Correspondence, or as was later known, the Committee of Foreign Affairs. See, everything's a committee. The salient characteristics of this development are apparent. There is, in the first place, an incipient tendency towards specialization of functions, which looks toward the removal of administration as such from Congress to other bodies, leaving to Congress the duties of organization, definition of duties, appropriation, and control. On the other hand, there is a personal fusion of power, the administrative officers being also members of Congress, from the fact that these bodies are not only administrative agencies but committees. There resulted a continuation of the practice of permitting them to report not only on individual matters but on policies and even administrative laws. Page 51 at the top. Let's listen to let's catch our breath here and listen to the waterfall. All right. Okay, page 51 at the top. Noise removal back on. The element of order and system thus introduced should not be overemphasized. Throughout the whole of the period of the war, minor administrative agencies multiplied with astounding rapidity. Especially this was true in the service of supply. There were the commissary general and his deputies, the clothier general, the commissaries of forage, the commissaries of hides, special committees of Congress to purchase certain bills of goods in quite the original style of doing business, state agencies doing business with continental funds, et cetera, et cetera. It would be futile to attempt to discuss the relations of these one with another. Everything was confusion. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Everything was confusion. And the confusion was only worse, confounded when Congress sought to effect a cure by introducing further complexity. See, this is the problem with legislative bodies, councils. They only think in legislative terms. They don't think in terms of executive discretion, getting things done. Like, bam, someone is responsible, one person. They don't think that way. They think in terms of we got to have a committee. A committee will do that. And so the more people you add, the further complexity you add. And the more lines of communication, the more possibilities for misunderstanding, the more possibilities for laziness, for gossip, division, factionalism. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. Everything was confusion, and the confusion was only worse confounded when Congress sought to effect a cure by introducing further complexity. Yeah, what's the cure for the complexity? More complexity. You see how they were in this loop. It was like a trauma loop, and they couldn't get out of it. Nor did the devolution of a portion of actual administration to other bodies prevent Congress from devoting large parts of its time to matters which should never have come before it at all. Nor did the devolution of a portion of actual administration to other bodies prevent Congress from devoting large parts of its time to matters which should never have come before it at all. In other words, legislative bodies, councils, they meddle. They like meddling. That's the nature of what they do. They meddle. And the more people you have, the worse it is. Even the incomplete indices of the printed journals list special committees after special committee dealing with individual matters of this kind. Congress, too, continued until the end to settle matters of minute detail on its floor. Oh, man. Leaving to the administrative agency the ministerial duty of carrying out each decision as it was reached. This sounds like hell. It is common knowledge that this system failed. It is common knowledge that this system failed and failed lamentably. Inefficiency and waste, if not downright peculation and corruption, were as sure to follow as the night the day. In the wake of the inefficiency came discontent, a discontent which seized upon certain features of the system as the causes of the general administrative debacle and demanded reformation. Specifically, three general reforms were asked: personal separation of powers, unitary departmental control, and integration. Over this platform, there arose a difference of opinion which divided Congress, wherever its personnel, whatever its personnel, into continuing schools, the liberatives and the constructives of Wharton's famous description, page 52 at the top. The former were the national counterparts of those opponents of governmental energy whom we met in the States. The latter correspond to those political leaders who had struggled in the States for unitary military control and the executive veto. You see where the lines are being drawn there? Okay. It was only by slow degrees that a partial recognition of these demands was secured. In October 1777, the Congressional Board of War and Ordnance was replaced by a board of 3 who were not members of Congress. Oh, okay, we're getting somewhere. They were not members of Congress, but within a year, 2 congressional members were added. Okay, never mind, backwards. In 1779, the Marine Committee gave way to an Admiralty Board composed of 2 congressional and 3 non-congressional members, and the Treasury Committee to a similarly constructed Treasury Board. Finally, in 1781, the executive forced the executives, with quotations around, that's the party that wants unitary, not committees, but unitary discretion. In 1781, the executives, that faction, forced the issue and won a complete victory. January 10th, provision was made for a Department of Foreign Affairs under the leadership of a secretary. There's the unitary executive right there, a secretary. And a month later, the Departments of War, of Marine, and of the Treasury were similarly organized. All right, we're getting somewhere. That these defects that were sought to be remedied were the fundamental cause of the difficulty may be well doubted. The truth was that the internal organization of Congress and its lack of power were even more at fault. It may especially be doubted whether, if there had been a more complete devolution of administrative discretion to the committees and less waste of time by Congress itself, the personal duality of functions might not have proved satisfactory. Be that as it may, the attitude of the executive school was definite and comprehensible. The executive school has got quotations around it because that's the name of the people that want a separate power separated from the legislator, called executive. Now, Washington was the attitude of the executive school was definite and comprehensible. Washington, that's George Washington, was one of the earliest, as he was one of the most consistent proponents of the combined ideas. As early as July 10th, 1775, he wrote as follows to Congress. This is a block quote. I should be extremely deficient in gratitude as well as justice if I did not take the first opportunity to acknowledge the readiness and attention which the provincial Congress and different committees have shown to make everything as convenient and agreeable as possible. But there is a vital and inherent principle of delay incompatible with military service in transacting business through such numerous and different channels. He continues the block quote, I esteem it therefore my duty to represent the inconvenience that must unavoidably ensue from dependence on a number of persons for supplies, and submit it to the consideration of the Congress whether the public service will not be best promoted by appointing a commissary general for these purposes. Notice, a commissary general, unitary executive, not a committee, a commissary general. Now, that's the end of the quote there. Not only the creation of the general officers of supply, but the civil office of Board of War were the results of his recommendation. Remember, that was 1775. And the great reorganization of 1781 had been strongly recommended by him. Now, I think we're going to stop there. We're on page 53. And I've enjoyed this time with you. We're going to continue our thoughts on what Washington thought and how he shaped the move toward isolating executive administrative discretion out of the committee system in the legislature to its own thing, a branch of government which is about executive action, administration, responsibility, getting things done. and having a unitary figure, one person in charge, a single unit of consciousness who is responsible for getting things done. And this was a hard lesson for the Americans to learn, but they did eventually learn it. We're going to continue our story about how that unfolded next time. And we're ending on page 53. And so we're going to make a note of that in our notes here on the Republican Professor podcast. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. It's 5 June, 2026 years after Jesus. It's a Friday, coming to you from the backyard of my common sense epistemology mentor, Dr. Doug Geivett. And if you don't have a common sense epistemology mentor, go out and get one today. And ask for one for Christmas. They're great stocking stuffers. My mentor, Dr. Doug Geivett, has written a number of books, and he's been on the podcast. Check his episode out. He studied with Dr. Dallas Willard at USC for his Ph.D. in philosophy. Dr. Dallas Willard was a common sense philosopher extraordinaire, and so we're so happy to have that heritage. So we've been interacting with, again, The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history by Charles C. Thach, Jr., and published by Liberty Fund Press. Go out and get your copy today. And we'd like to thank Liberty Fund for making this material available. We'd like to thank Charles C. Thach, Jr. for writing it. Thank you, Charles. So we'll continue on page 53 in chapter 3, National Executive Power, next time. Happy 250th anniversary of the United States of America. God bless you guys.